Coogs House. The sky is the limit at the University of Houston. At least that's according to one very optimistic head football coach.
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Cougs, the daily podcast all about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth. And whether you're a Houston fan or just a hater who's going to stop by, thank you for being Locked On Cougs, your first listen of the day. You want to join the conversation but don't know what to say? Tell us in the comments down below. When it comes to cards, this is all talking about Vegas and Big 12 Media Days. So when it comes to cards, what is your game of choice? I'm a spades person myself. I don't typically play with red twos being worth anything, but some people do. I'm a spades person, though. All kinds of different house rules there. Tell us what you like to play down below. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, and more on that fun later. We got a lot to talk about today, given Willie Fritz's comments at Big 12 Media Days yesterday. A lot of optimism and positivity. I want to talk some about some differences it feels like he noticed between the Big 12, his past media days. He's been doing this thing a long time. So his first year in Houston being different is worth noting, I think. I want to talk some about the comments he had about recruiting because it is the summertime. It's a big factor in the football program, what they've been doing this summer. But first and foremost, the sky is the limit, according to Willie Fritz. And I think that the optimism is something we should all be leaning into. And I know most coaches are optimistic on July 10th. Today is July 11th. And I feel like, honestly, it's fair for people to be like, well, that's nothing notable or noteworthy. However, I think there was a seriousness and an intent and a lack of a delay. I'm one that has personally said, I think this program is going to take a couple of years to rebuild. This year is about, getting people off and on the bus. Next year is about getting people in the right seats. And the year after that is getting the bus moving in the right direction, right? This is a multi-year process. Nothing is a light switch in college football, even with the transfer portal, even with NIL, et cetera, right? I don't know. Willie Fritz agrees with that. Now, I don't mean to say that he's not looking at the big picture, but I do think that he has this vision for a program that is competing very quickly. One of the things he said about winning on the day at one point was he says, I quote, want to win them all. And I want players that want to win them all too. It doesn't really matter where they have you picked before the season. This is going to be my 33rd year as a head football coach. And I've been picked last and finished first. I've been picked first and finished third. I like that quote too, because you anticipate him saying been picked first and finished last. Says, no, that hadn't happened. Right. But he also went on further later to say that he feels like Houston has some ability. We really do. And he spoke glowingly about both Donovan Smith and his running back Parker Jenkins at different points of the media stuff with different outlets. And so I want to get into Donovan Smith stuff in a second and why the optimism is there. I think that he sees this as a team ready to compete more so that's given credit for presently. Again, I think that Oklahoma game in week 2 is a big statement piece. Oklahoma is ripe for upsets. It happens all the time. Houston was doing that, it wasn't even quite a decade ago, but it feels like ages ago, right? And it's also a schedule full of games where Houston's going to have to compete. Houston kind of has to enter with at least a mindset that this is not a rebuilding team, because if you just think, oh, we're just rebuilding, everything's okay, you're going to have a bunch of these games where it's like, I don't know that is okay, because, very quickly you've got challenging teams on your schedule. And UNLV at the gate is not a give me by any stretch. I mean, these are talented football programs. But the idea that, he's got this great stable of backs, as he called it, quote, I'm very impressed with those guys this spring. One thing we're going to do is play a lot of those guys the first few weeks, kind of figure out the rotation. Hadn't had a lot of live action at practice. He also went on to praise Parker Jenkins as his lead running back, but wasn't necessarily opposed to Burnett and other guys and Stacey Snead's back and those kinds of options. So he clearly sees those guys as a talented group, and that while someone may separate themselves the first few weeks of the season in a run-heavy offense that we know Kevin Barbie is going to run, they're going to get a very equal spread of carries, which is maybe not something I would have thought, right? I kind of would have thought Parker's the guy. Burnett maybe comes in after him, and Stacey Snead comes down and catches the ball on third down, right? That's not how this is going to move. They might actually play 1, 2, 3 downs every series down the field, right? And then I think the other optimism in the talent of this team, when he says the sky's the limit for Houston, is Donovan Smith. He talked about Donovan having been to Manning Passing Academy and showing out there. Apparently had a very good outing at that academy. Obviously, college coaches are counselors for younger kids, but they're also working and learning akin to like the Jordan basketball camp from back in the day, like LeBron and Carmelo would have been at or whatever, right? They work with Peyton and Eli and Archie and really kind of develop their own skills while leading kids through drills and stuff like that. Said that after camp, Archie, to one outlet, he said that after the camp, Archie reached out personally and said, "Hey, this kid is an impressive young man," and talked about the intelligence that Donovan has in playing the position. I think when Donovan has had turnover problems in the past, and it's not every game, but he has had games where that's become a problem based on what they're doing and what Houston's doing or what they're doing, what Tech was doing when he was there. He said, this kid's a very intelligent young quarterback. He said Archie echoed the same. And then he talked about this past spring and a little insight where they were, not telling us necessarily last spring, they're using the microphone and helmet technology. Big 12 and NCAA are both allowing that throughout the season next year. And so it sounds like spring was kind of a chance to toy with that. A lot more toying on defense. You want to know what player to give it to, what position to give it to, what works best. For on offense, you're kind of building your rapport on how that's going to work throughout the game. And it sounds like there'd be a lot of times where, because Donovan couldn't play in the spring with his labrum surgery, Willie and Donovan would be having conversations while the headphones set, because the headphones set for the quarterback on the field cuts off about 20 seconds left in the play clock. So for the rest of the pre-snap and snap, you'd have Donovan and Willie kind of talking through the play behind it. And that, I think, is an important piece of his learning that Willie knows about, Don knows about, and the team may know about it, and that may be a source of this optimism that we're kind of piecing together here, right? Well, Donovan hadn't taken a whole lot of reps in this offense or system or offensive coordinator system or whatever. He and Willie have trust because of what they've built thus far this spring, even without him necessarily making a pass, right? Now, it sounds like Manning Passing Academy, he was airing it out. Balls are traveling 65 yards in the air, kind of airing it out. And that's all going well, right? But I think that leads back to this idea that Houston has reason to be optimistic, right? And then that's the present tense. And Willie, I think, is not backing down from the challenge in the present tense. But he did open the door to this being the sleeping giant that we've talked about for a year and a half, 2 years now, as long as this podcast has been around, honestly. And mentioned that, quote, when we finish our football operations center, which is going to be in the next 9 or 10 months, we'll have one of the best facilities, Fritz thinks, in the state of Texas. I really do, he said. 161,000 square feet, $161 million. It's going to be outstanding. We got a great indoor, we got great outdoor practice field, a great stadium. I think one thing that Houston was lacking was the league. Speaking of the Big 12, that's what's kept them out from getting some of the players they should have gotten in terms of recruiting. And he sees all this is coming together perfectly in the next year, right? So while he had optimism this year, and I think his confidence in what he's got going on in the running back and quarterback position leads to that, he also did not deny the fact that this thing is kind of catching up when the facilities are done and adding themselves in this football league, being the Big 12 and so on, and to be, kind of beefing its resume up for recruits to then go get those recruits and bring those kids in. Now, I want to talk about more things he said on recruiting and some things that I really liked. They said on recruiting throughout the media day. But first, in recruiting, you're trying to build a winning team, and passion, drive, and patience are the formula for winning championships, but they're also what keeps your ride or die alive. Even Motors is everything you need to maintain your vehicle, level up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you need speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. Over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die. You'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because eBay Motors, you're burning rubber and not cash. Of the parts you need and the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible ones only. Exclusive supply. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. I'd only tag in there on eBay that my father-in-law is also a big cars person. I'm not a big cars person necessarily, but some of the stuff he was showing me on eBay that like very affordable ways to upgrade your ride are tremendous. I want to talk some about recruiting and what Fritz's comments on recruiting are, because I think that's actually what took off from his commentary, even though it's maybe not what I took away the most from his commentary at Big 12 Media Days. And by take off, I mean like the rest of the country is running with, right? To Dave Campbell's, he called Houston the best high school, said that Houston had, quote, the best high school football in the nation. It's here in the state of Texas. And I think the epicenter of football is in Houston, Texas, right? Talked a lot about the different trips he made and things like that, and said, quote, I did not get on a plane in December or January. We did recruit some Louisiana kids as well, and wanted to talk about how like the big goal here is keeping kids from the area to stay home and play for Houston. He reiterated the point about not taking a plane to recruit several different times to several different outlets. It was a clear piece of his messaging to what they're building in Houston. Now, I think people, when they're figuring out like what the best recruiting strategy is, looking at some of the bigger national brands and saying, well, they're recruiting nationally, the Ohio States, the Alabamas, the Georgias, right, et cetera. You're like, well, eventually the goal is to get there, I would assume. And that's not necessarily what Fritz thinks. He's got the talent here in Houston. And frankly, it's worth pointing out that all the talent in Houston is the talent other schools are coming to get, right? And so I think that that's an important piece of this. He mentioned that when kids stay close to home, so a Houston area kid, a Southeast Texas kid, a kid from with a drivable distance home, right? He says that kids seem to have less problems, seem to be a little happier when they're fairly close to home. Their parents can come and watch them play easily. You can go home and, like with what happened the last couple of days, mentioning the hurricane, I told kids to stay home on Sunday, right? He thinks that this is a key piece of this, that the accessibility to their homes, to their families, for the kinds of kids and families Willie Fritz is intent on recruiting is an important deal. And I think that that all complements each other so well for a guy rebuilding, restarting this program. He's not new to this. He's coached at Blinn. He's coached at Sam Houston State. He coached at Willis High School. He understands the area very well. He also, in working at Tulane, understands being a resurging program or a building program in an area ripe to get plucked by other schools, right? Tulane sits in the same backyard as the LSU's, obviously, but also has Ole Miss and Alabama coming in to their background and taking kids. A&M tries to as well, right? And those kinds of things. And he mentioned that kids seem to think those bigger programs is like a grass is always greener kind of situation. And someone asked him, I think it was 365 Sports, asked him about this idea of like, okay, but like rebuilding this program, you had to hit the transfer portal some, right? And he mentioned that, when he took over the program, I think he said 5. I think it might have been 8, but he said there were 5 kids committed at the high school level. So they did have to hit the transfer portal up some because the class was so small, right? But when recruiting transfers, he also echoed the same sentiments, which is kind of not what I think most media outlets expected. He was like, no, no, no. When people from this area leave and go to other programs and other people coach them up and whatever, kids think the grass is greener at these established programs elsewhere, when the reality is it was green at home too, right? And he says that at Tulane he had several different examples of that happen where kids would leave New Orleans to go to the big time program and ultimately decide that it was best to come back home and play at Tulane. Uh, Houston has a similar vibe. Well, it's not a group of five school anymore. It's certainly still kind of like working its way out of that reputation from a football perspective. And, he did have academic handcuffs that he mentioned in full disclosure at Tulane, right? Tulane does not put any wiggle room as an academics institution on its athletic programs. It's not quite Stanford and Duke in that sense, but it really does alter the kind of kid that you have to recruit, right? And he said that opened up, they did have to make some sort of national concessions in recruiting just because Louisiana is a smaller state, right? There's just not as many people there. It is per capita a great NFL producing state. And he said that because of the connections he's built there and its proximity to Houston in relation to Texas, it's not talking about El Paso. We were talking about Houston very close to Louisiana, right? They've continued to keep those relationships and recruit Louisiana as well. But again, the goal is the part of Louisiana that you can drive to. He's not taking planes across the state, right? He's keeping kids in drivable distances to close to home and close to Houston for good reason. All right. I think a lot of older alumni will think of like Andre Ware being from Dickinson, right? Or these guys that have built this program at Oliver fairly recently being a top end recruit nationally from the city of Houston. You got a bunch of people talking about the North Shore programs or the legacy of the Katy programs and pulling in people from those historically strong high school football teams and getting them to stay home. I think that this resonates with a large audience, and I feel like what he's doing really well there is it was consistent, it was intentional, and it frankly might be the more viral side of the things he said is that he didn't take a plane in recruiting. And if you're a kid in Houston right now wondering how to represent the city, I think that's all said to you, right? I think you're the kid he's talking to. And I think that that's an important piece of this is that he understood how media day is supposed to go. He understood the power of what he was doing and the stage he was standing on, even if it was one of the bigger media day stages that he's been on. And I'll talk about the difference between that media stage and other media stages that he mentioned, and talk about, how interesting it was to see him kind of own it in a second. But first, they were in Vegas for media days. Vegas is a city where you can, hit it big and win very, very quickly. And FanDuel.com hopes you have that option wherever you are as well. Listen, I love sports. I love winning. I love, making things interesting. And FanDuel is the best place to do that. FanDuel.com is the best place to check that out. If you're into Wimbledon going on right now, WNBA basketball, MLB seems to be having things to happen different every day. The Astros are surging. Pay attention to those guys right now. Or you're looking to get into on action before the Olympics and football this fall. All summer, FanDuel is hooking up customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. So at FanDuel.com, start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, the sports betting partner of the Major League Baseball. Now, Fritz made the point several times, talk about the big stage he was on at Big 12 Media Day, right? And it was asked of him several times what it was like to be a coach in his position coming up to get there, right? Fritz is not a young puppy. He's been around a long time. He's been a head football coach for 33 years. And someone's 33 years old. That was a long time. And he also mentioned, when asked about those kinds of things, kind of as far back as he could remember what college football media days were like when he started. And he mentioned being at Blinn Junior College and going to a media day at a library at Navarro Community College, and how like they just kind of sat around and took questions from reporters and spoke into little handheld recorders and stuff like that, right? And the gigantic difference that is between being at a televised and recorded event in Las Vegas, which Brett Yormark called the epicenter of sports entertainment in America. And I might have the qualm with a little bit of that, but it is obviously the biggest city in entertainment. And talks about just like how, truthfully, it's, as far as the media day goes, a lot of the same kinds of things. It's talking about your program and developing your program and what your program's doing, and people want to know how you're doing what you're doing. And the recipe's kind of been the same for a long time for Willie Fritz, right? Recruit, retain, develop, right? That's what he's always said. When asked about the Big 12 as a league in general, I thought it was interesting that he thought, and this was, I don't think intentionally to echo Brett Yormark's discussions, but much like you and I talked about Brett Yormark's comments on parity being a good thing for Houston, he mentioned that he thought Power 4 football, and what could very well soon be Power 3 football, is all about more depth. Both as a league and as teams in the league. The biggest difference between what he did at Tulane and what he's done at Houston, he said, that there were more depth. He said, they played Power 5 teams at the time when he was at Tulane, and it wasn't necessarily the top end guys were a whole lot different, but it was always the second, the third team, or that third or fourth receiver, that second and third best offensive or defensive lineman. That's where the windows and gaps get created, right? And into that at Tulane, he had these strict academic standards where he couldn't, he had trouble recruiting against the big dogs, and then at Houston's got a lot more leeway to, trust a kid's character more and be like, no, this kid can be a Houston kid, right? He called the Big 12 a well-coached league too. He said he's gone through and watched film on all the head coaches and other teams in the league thus far. He said when he could, he watched them play Houston, though Houston obviously didn't play every team in the league last year, and there are a bunch of new teams in the league this year. So he feels familiar with how those teams were. Pause. I do think it was interesting that he mentioned he didn't watch last season's Houston films for the first 6 or 8 weeks of his time on task in Houston. Not because he didn't want to watch it, but because he wanted his own fresh eyes be his first opinion, first impression of his roster, right? He didn't want, past, bad play or good play to cloud his decision-making in looking at the Houston Cougar roster, which was interesting. He obviously eventually did get around to it. But that was an interesting and intentional move, he said, that he made while looking at Houston. As far as looking at the rest of the Big 12, though, as I, get myself back on track, he mentioned that he thought it was a well-coached league. I thought it was an interesting comment coming from a guy who's, of the returning Big 12 schools, the only new head coach, right? To say that, he's impressed by the level of coaching that happened around the Big 12. But, I would pick my qualms with Aranda or Gundy or Brown, and he actually had glowing things to say about each one. And some of that is gamesmanship, some of that is playing the part, some of that is just not being a jerk. But also I think some of it is a genuine understanding of no, I can't consider myself too big for my britches, where yes, he's won conferences at every level, but he can't get over ahead of himself and out ahead of his skis. This is a big challenge. And balancing that with the optimism I think we opened with is, frankly, I think the story of this Houston Cougar football season. There's all of these reasons to be optimistic. There will continue to be qualitative reasons to be very positive about the way this program is going. I maintain I don't think it's a light switch. And while they're going to upset some people this year, they're going to win games that people in the national media might not think they should win. And they're going to be a better football team than I think the 15th out of 16 ranking from the media poll had them at, or whatever. I do think the best days for Houston Cougar football are more like 2 and 3 years down the road. And I think part of that is that this is the Big 12, right? This is a conference that is seeking to be on the same playing field as the SEC and the Big 10, whether it's there yet right now. It's pushing for that very clearly. That was the sentiment at media days. And this is the big leagues. And while it might have taken Houston a minute to realize that that's where they're in and that's where they were headed, they're in the big leagues now. And I think Willie Fritz is a big league ball coach. And I think, frankly, he handled himself very, very well. Having seen his predecessor year before, who had been familiar with Big 12 media days, I thought Fritz was very composed and a lot more able to understand the moment, understand the tools at his disposal with the media day. I'm not going to talk a lot about previous regimes, but he seemed very confident in what was going on. Frankly, with a program roster that you could argue had less reason to be. Now, I think there's talent on this roster, but he does not return the same amount of starters that the guy before him did, right? And I think that it's interesting that he's got the confidence that he does, even with the understanding of how challenging the league is going to be that he also clearly had. I'm going to be following him and his stuff each and every day. Obviously, we have basketball program to talk about, the basketball tournaments to talk about, the Olympics coming up, a bunch of Houston athletes in that as well. Recruiting stuff, recruiting. It is the summertime. All kinds of big things ahead of your Locked On Coogs. So make sure you subscribe, hit the bell so you know we're live. If you want more on Big 12 Media Days, obviously Locked On Big 12 is a place to do that. So go check out that for your second listen of the day. Locked On Coogs is a proud member of the Locked On Podcast Network. It means your team, our Houston Cougars, each and every day. Go Cougs.